Welcome to I Hate James Dobson, a podcast founded on the deadliest sin of all, the sin of empathy. Welcome to I Hate James Dobson. This is Jake. This week, I had the privilege of talking to Talia Lavin, the author of Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America, which we covered in depth in our last episode. Brooke was unfortunately unable to join us as she had to, help people at her job, which I guess is a fine enough excuse. Talia was so generous with her time, and we got to talk about homeschooling, leaving fundamentalist communities, sandwiches, and, of course, why we hate James Dobson. I'm so thankful for the conversation, and I hope you enjoyed as well. And now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome to I Hate James Dobson. My name is Jake. I'm a former evangelical turned queer sex therapist, and today I am honored to be joined by the author of Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. She's also a journalist with bylines in so many major publications, from The New Yorker to The Washington Post to Rolling Stone. Please welcome to the show the brilliant, the amazing Talia Lavin. Talia, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to have an outlet for my absolute loathing of James Dobson.
It's amazing how much rage one person can inspire.
Yeah, I really loathe the guy, and I didn't even grow up Christian, and so there's really no one in my daily life I can talk to about it. Just I hate him.
And so let's start there. Why do you hate James Dobson?
Because he is a charismatic and widely listened to and folksy advocate of child torture. That's my primary beef with him. It's
Yeah,
child torture that he advocates and has written so many books about.
I think that's very fair. I think that's a good reason to hate the fucker.
Yeah, I mean, it's just child torture. Just say no.
I don't think it would be that hard, but uh, surprisingly, it's amazing to me how much just a folksy demeanor can obscure the fact that you're just abusing and torturing children. Like if you say it with enough of a southern twang, people will be like, "Aw, you're so cute. Sure, I'll listen to you."
Yeah, it's like I had this conversation with my mom the other day of just where she's like, "Oh, Mike Johnson, he seems like a nice guy." I'm like,
Oh,
"Yeah, that's what he's good at, is seeming like a nice guy. That's his job, is to seem
hmm.
like a nice guy. He's not a nice guy. He would fucking cut your throat."
He'd do it very
Um,
politely though.
and
He
not
might apologize
even
afterwards.
yeah, he would cut your throat and not think twice, and do it from a distance so he could maintain politesse. But yeah, it's this very specific species of evangelical manhood where the sort of seeming politeness is really at the core, where if you can be calm and you can be well mannered, you can get away with absolutely anything, and it works shockingly well.
Hmm.
as if as if evil always showed up screaming incoherently. That's not how evil works.
No. For people so focused on, the Antichrist will come and he'll be a deceiver and he'll do all these things but have these secret ulterior motives, they really are gullible for people doing the exact same things they claim to be looking out for, just because they do it in the name of white Christian Jesus.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't believe in the Antichrist, so that,
Yeah.
or the Christ for that matter. So, I'm kind of out of it, in those terms, but yeah, it's crazy. I mean, I also think, whatever, there's lots of stuff that I go into in the book about that kind of pattern seeking and how
Hmm.
it kind of predisposes you to paranoia.
Hmm.
Yeah, it makes everything is about ferreting out some like hidden or secret truth, and so that makes, very obvious things very like paradoxically invisible. Because like if it
Yeah,
really true and really important, well, I wouldn't know about it.
exactly. When we were doing our episodes on Left Behind, I said like it's just not sexy, right? To the fact that there might be a global conspiracy with all these people like working for the Antichrist, that's intriguing. That's secret. The fact that it's, you know, five corporations who are destroying the environment and buying our elections, that's rote. We know about that. That's not exciting. That's not interesting, but it's that secret knowledge that's so intriguing.
Well, yeah, because secret knowledge makes you important, right? But
Mm,
just like, fighting for the greater good is a fucking slog.
hmm.
There's no one who's gonna like jump out and say, well done, my good and faithful servant.
Hmm.
That's not gonna happen.
One of the things that I love about the book that and also the way that you're speaking now, like you do such a great job of like immersing yourself in this culture. It's such a there's such a language to it that I think if people aren't raised in it or don't like really look into things like calling someone a good and faithful servant can just kind of like fly by them. They don't understand the like gravitas of such a thing. A big part of your perspective in this book was that of being an outsider. In the introduction, you talk about how being Jewish makes one keenly aware of the background music, the hegemony of Christianity in the United States. So what was it like to submerge yourself in these writings and doing these interviews?
In some ways it was actually kind of cathartic.
Mm,
Like when you grow up kind of constantly on the edge of this culture, but not fully understanding it just because like, that isn't your argot, like you haven't been raised with it. You haven't like you don't have the inherent insight that comes from being raised to revere these figures. Then yeah, I think it's like so finally sort of getting into the meat of it and understanding what makes this culture tick to me was actually, yeah, like quite cathartic and fascinating. And then in terms of like what it was actually like to read, a bunch of absolutely brutal child torture manuals, like it wasn't super fun.
no.
It was very emotionally challenging. It was, I don't want to say traumatic because certainly the things was discussing were traumatic, but the trauma was the trauma of others,
Mm,
so I don't want to appropriate that to myself, but there were definitely some moments exploring this type of material, always I would say like begets a certain, there's like a certain level of ambient dread that you carry
yeah.
around with you when you're just like constantly reading about and engaging with the worst of human nature, as I did with my first book as well. So I guess just like spelunking into the abyss of the human soul is a some sort of weird hobby of mine by this point.
Sure.
And that was also an experience of getting to know the argot, like the jargon of
Hmm.
like these isolated these sort of self segregated communities. So it's not that I'm like, oh, like evangelicals are Nazis. It's that I'm like, well, I know what it's like to sort of in that like good and faithful servant kind of way, um, really delve into the way I think the most important way you can learn about a community is to figure out how they talk to each
Yeah.
other. Like internal communications are the best guide. And so what I was really looking at was, okay, like how can I obtain primary sources and
Hmm.
firsthand interviews? And that was really my guiding, like my lodestar here.
Yeah. I think the in therapy we really try to understand the language that people use, but not just the words, the meaning that people attach to it. And in therapy we talk about co-constructing language to say like in this therapeutic space when we say depressed, it has this meaning. It's not just sad, it's what depressed means for you. And to understand people in that relational context, language is such an important part of that. Um, I have just a whole section of my notes here that are just praise that I have for this book. But one of the things that I really, really appreciate is how you go about talking about these interviews. And in our last episode, I said that you let people tell their stories through your book, and I think that's really admirable. I also really appreciate that it is your book and your writing is not mean or spiteful, but also you don't pull punches. A quote that I couldn't find a place for last time that I really appreciate is when you describe Ron DeSantis as, quote, a cunning, unscrupulous man who never met a suit that liked him and never met an evangelical who didn't.
I mean, like, I'm gonna if you're gonna be bitchy about absolutely anyone, like, I don't feel the need to, like, my attitude in general with both this and the previous book and also my, articles and newsletter and whatnot is like I don't think it compromises my value as a commentator or journalist to be straight about where I'm standing and
Mhm.
who I am. I don't really believe in sort of journalistic objectivity in the sense of like killing the author.
Yeah.
I think that all too often in my profession, that's a blind for like anyone who isn't a white man is inherently biased. And it's often used to sort of critique or box out marginalized perspectives.
Hmm.
So, and while I'm not saying I have a marginalized perspective, I'm more saying that like, okay, like I'm telling you I'm a leftist and that I find this culture reprehensible, but like neither do I find it excusable to simply because I find something reprehensible dismiss its importance,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And that this is something that I've said kind of from the start of this project, of this podcast, is I feel like people miss, they're so busy laughing at like oh my God, they're talking about sex in this weird and gross way, which is fun and true, and it's fun to make fun of and true, but there's a deeper understanding, there's a deeper implication for these people, for these cultures, for the James Dobsons of the world. And so, I was really struck by the refrain of like, yes, these people really believe that they're in a spiritual war. And yes, they really want to transform America into a theocracy. What about the Christian right? What about evangelicalism? Do you think that the broader public doesn't understand?
Everything? I mean, there's like I'm so
Fair.
I that's like maddening as a response, and I apologize. It's more just that like what is well understood? I mean, it was like the only people that I felt like were as alarmed as I was were people that got out of
Mm,
this culture. And I know that that's a hell of a slog. The other piece of it is that I grew up in a like we didn't call ourselves this, but what might be like very credibly termed a fundamentalist religious community. I grew up an
mm,
Orthodox Jew. I didn't grow up you know, a Jew who like goes to synagogue twice a year or whatever. It was every week and it was, 25 hours of the Sabbath without any access to technology. It was I first wrote with a pen on the Sabbath, when I was like 17 and was like, "Oh my God, God's gonna strike me down." And then he didn't, and I kept doing it. But
mm,
this idea that God and faith and a faith community absolutely determines your life and has a really big role in your life intimately um is something that was very familiar to me. Like it wasn't weird at all. Now the nature of that faith was very different
mm.
and there's something about being a hegemonic faith that I think inherently twists and toxifies religion. It's
Hmm.
not as if there isn't a country that has a majority of Jews and like it hasn't been covering itself in glory lately.
Sure.
My general take on theocracies is that they are more concerned with the soul than the body,
Mm,
and
mm,
that very preoccupation covers a multitude of unimaginable cruelties to the bodies of
mhm.
people who are disfavored or people who don't conform, whether that's through queerness, through, nonconformity with these very rigid gender norms, or, other ways of refusal to conform in identity and in ideas. I wasn't weirded out at all by the concept of a life shaped by faith because
Mhm.
for the first, you know, 2 decades of my life, I had one. On the other
Mhm.
hand, the faith that I was raised with never demanded or expected, it demanded and expected a significant amount of conformity. I grew up in a religious town and like I remember, my neighbor texting my mom when she saw me walking down the street in like a tank top kind of a thing. So there was
Mhm.
all these norms about modesty and so on. But like we weren't expected to be like these like obedient, hyper obedient like drones and not have questions
Yeah.
and not think for ourselves. I mean, Judaism is very founded on argument and question. Um,
Yeah.
and the pressure to conform was like much more social than ideological, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I do think a lot of journalists in the US like come from these sort of relatively secular backgrounds and lack the sort of sympathetic imagination to conceive that not everyone comes from a similar background to them, that like faith can have a very different place than sort of just something that makes you feel good and, something you experience from a distance, or just like Jesus is nice and it tells me to be nice to people. Like it
Yeah.
that's not what faith means for tens of millions of Americans. And if you find yourself incapable of sort of putting yourself in a space in your mind where you can imagine a different attitude, then you wind up like the general attitude in the US press towards like evangelicals I found is this mix of like undue deference where it's like, ah,
Mhm.
shucks, these guys are the real soul of America and everyone else is phony. And then but at the same time, like these dumb rubes,
Yeah.
and also just this like weird skepticism of like they can't possibly believe that. And like, no, they very obviously do because they say they do and then act as if they do. And like, what the fuck are you basing this assertion that like they cannot have these motivations on, you know?
Yeah. In my especially early deconstruction, I found it so frustrating that like lack of criticism around evangelicalism and the Christian right generally. It's like even this, like I saw yesterday, Hakeem Jeffries tweeted something to the effect of like, presidents come and go, but God never changes. Like,
Guy, aren't you like literally the head of the fucking opposition party in the House?
right,
You're
right,
you're like let go and let God? What the fuck are you for?
right. And it's this like, oh well, I am also a Christian and therefore I can't criticize either I can't criticize them and like bring them into the conversation and say, how dare you? Or the thing that I hate the most is like, well, they're not real Christians. It's like, okay,
Oh my
maybe.
God, let's talk about it because let me tell you
The wash
something.
clip.
Let me tell you something. Here's where like being a Jew is like makes that whole thing insane.
Mhm.
It's like, what the fuck are you saying? Like you don't realize that what you're saying is that true Christianity can only be goodness.
Mm,
Like, then what about the pogroms? What about the Crusades? What about the fucking Holocaust? Like, let's talk about
mhm.
it. Because if
Yeah.
you're telling me that none of those people were Christians, because they did bad things, then, what the fuck are you saying about Christian history? Like
Hmm.
every pope ever wasn't Christian? Fine, maybe if you're a Protestant you can say that. What about Martin fucking Luther? He was not a particularly nice
No.
guy. You know what I mean? Like, and it's this very particular form of Christian supremacy that's almost impossible
Yes.
to get people to abandon. And
Hmm.
at a certain point, I'm like, fine, whatever. Like, if you need to preserve this idea of a Christian faith that is sort of holy and innocent, and oh, Jesus was just like a nice Jewish boy who, like, first of all, I hate that because, like,
Oh my God. The was like Messianic Judaism is like I think the like label that people throw around of like, well, I worship a Jew, so I can't be anti-Semitic.
well, God, I mean, Messianic Jews don't agree on anything, and the only thing we all agree on is we hate those fuckers. Because what they are is they're a predatory evangelical cult,
Hmm.
built to like isolate, prey on isolated and vulnerable Jews, because we're like extra special prizes to win over to Big J. But like, here's the thing. Like at the end of the day, it's an uphill battle, and if people want to bring their iteration of their faith into like the struggle, I get like who am I to disagree? I just find it this like staggering combination of arrogance and naivete to be like, well, no one bad can be a real Christian who believes in Jesus. I'm
Yeah.
like, these people absolutely center every element of their lives around Jesus. Um, and know a lot about the gospel and the scripture, and they have readings that are antithetical to yours.
Yeah.
They do not have the same readings that you do, and your readings are not an inevitability, and you're not some theological authority above reproach. Like,
Yeah. It's this like pursuit of perfection and that the like no true Christian kind of fallacy of like, well, it also to me is this like distancing, right? Of like, oh, well, I got this a lot when I was starting to tell my story about like being kicked out of the church. Like, oh, I'm so sorry that like they did that to you, but they're not real Christians. It's like, one, I don't care. And two, like, take a look inward. There are some people in your good church that are full of real Christians who have those same beliefs. Sure, maybe I'm not asking you to go like burn down the church I was kicked out of, but like have the conversations with the people that you know that actually do have these conversations. And if you are truly wanting to support me, do that work. Recognize that that's a thing that you are around and you will take part in. It's not a condemnation so much of like any given person, at least to me, but don't distance yourself from it. Take accountability, take responsibility. You say something that I found really freeing was like, I don't have a competing version of Jesus to defend. And that's something that was really important in my deconstruction of like, oh yeah, I can have all these critiques and I have my own like ideas of the world, but I'm not like trying to be like, but this is the good Jesus, right? This is over here. I'm just gonna say that's fucked up. End of sentence.
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, sometimes it seems like they're not like Jesus saves. They're like, we gotta save Jesus
Yes.
from the wreck. Like they're like white knighting for Jesus, and that's whatever. Like people have their religious faith, and I think faith can be a tremendously constructive force. It can drive like so many amazing things, and so many of the people that have pushed for positive social change in America have been driven by deep religious convictions.
Yeah.
So I do want to say from the outset, I'm not denigrating like faith per se. I
Hmm.
am saying that this culture, that first of all, that this culture is deeply destructive and horrific. And second of all, that saying something is driven by sincere Christian faith and saying that it's phenomenally destructive to America, to humanity, these things are not mutually exclusive. Like you think because this is a sincerely held belief that like then that somehow renders it above reproach. No, absolutely not.
Hmm.
But you have to recognize it as what it is, not like like, yes, there are people who mask, a cynical desire for power under faith. And yes, there are people who, engage in reprehensible behavior under the mask of faith, sure. But like the majority of people who are saying that they're doing things you think are fucked up in the name of Jesus are doing it in the name of Jesus. Like
Yeah.
the biggest thing I've learned from studying like first Nazis and then the Christian right is like if people tell you what they believe, people tell you what they believe and why they're acting as they do, and then you take it upon yourself to say that can't be the reason. That's an inherent bias that you're dealing with, and you should not, and you should re-examine why you feel the need to ascribe other motivations to people who are telling you very plainly what their motivations are.
Yeah.
And in the case of Christianity, I think in many cases it's liberal Christians who will not acknowledge like the depth of their sort of naive attachment to faith, who like simply won't allow, they're like, ah, I gotta defend the honor of Jesus.
Hmm.
And that's fine, but acknowledge that's what you're doing in yourself.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just find the not real Christians, as a non-Christian, and particularly as a member of a different religion that's been like the target of Christian ire for millennia, like I find that no true Christian fallacies endlessly frustrating.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I'm like I gotta back off of this because it's never gonna work.
Yeah.
It's often counterproductive. And like if people want to like have their little delusions about how no true Christian could ever harm a fly, like fine.
Yeah. I think to me, as I view this work, this podcast, but also like I'm a therapist who has a very specific social justice orientation. It's all in the purpose of like trying to make a better world, right? But to do that, we have to first actually understand what is going on, and we have to be honest and clear-eyed about the state of things, and doing that like no real Christian or uh James Dobson had his flaws, but he's really a good man at heart. Like that's
No,
that's
he's
not what we're
not.
talking about. First of all, he's not. But second of all, that's not what we're talking about.
Like yeah, whatever. I mean, I've just like given up on the no true Christian stuff because if they're, because it's not ever gonna work, let alone coming from me.
Right.
Because the corollary to that, then, if like no true Christian can be immoral, then the sort of unspoken corollary is no non-Christian can ever be truly moral.
Hmm.
Like Christianity is the font from which morality flows, and that's sort of the underlying principle behind Christian supremacy that people
Yeah.
unwittingly, just by virtue of like living in a Christian supremacist country, fall into.
I think that is, at least in my personal journey of deconstruction, like that was a really important thing to like grapple with, is that I saw what I now understand of like these versions of evangelical morality cropping up in different ways, but like, oh, these are the bad people and these are the good people. That fundamental like black and white thinking was just a version of that internalized Christian morality. I just gotta like change the labels around it, who got to be good and who got to be bad. I think like moving past that and being able to have messy, difficult conversations, of which I had to look at my own complicity in these systems even after I had left the church, was really difficult, but I think really vital to be able to again try to build something better.
I mean, we all know how people love like difficult
Oh
introspective
yeah,
work and how appealing it is. And how
it's
people love the person that comes to them and is like, you have to do some difficult and introspective work about your assumptions. That makes me super popular.
I'm a therapist for reasons completely unrelated to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, but like whatever. I also have beef with the new atheists who basically don't realize that they're just evangelical Christians who put on an atheist hat.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. In my like early deconstruction days, I was in the like YouTube angry atheist kind of days. Thankfully, I didn't go like the Sargon of Akkad route, thank God. But like that, it's unsurprising to me that a number of those people now are basically just explicit Christians because their worldview was just evangelical Christianity. But again, those labels got switched. But the fundamental core of it remains the same.
Yeah, it's that like everything's black and white. Here are the good guys, here are the bad guys. And also just like no acknowledgement that like Christianity has a discrete belief system that
Yeah.
has its own kind of morality and assumptions that like do not hold true for every religion in the world. Like
Yeah.
you can't just say sky daddy because lots of religions have, sky daddy, sky mommy, sky children,
Hmm.
like
Earth-based deities too. Like it's not just guy. Yeah.
yeah, and like are you including like animism and reincarnation and
Hmm.
argument-based faiths and all this stuff? Like essentially there wasn't the thing that I found irritating in like my own jaunts into post-religious atheism was first that like there was absolutely no curiosity about any sort of um faith at all. Like there was no desire to understand the role it plays
Hmm.
in people and in life. And then the other piece was just like, oh, you hate women. You hate women so
Oh
much.
my God. Yeah.
Like, and that misogyny was just like, okay, this is just yet another culture where like you're like, okay, I hate religion, but I like the misogyny and I'm gonna keep that. It's like, okay,
Hmm.
cool. Anyway, we've wandered rather far afield and I apologize.
That's okay. I have one more set of questions about the book and then some broader pictures as well. In part two of the book, you focus on the family unit. And I think you draw a really compelling parallel between the Christian right's desire for the family and control of the family and their desires for the country. And that parallel is also the heart of the show, too. That's why we talk about the specific works of James Dobson, but then also talk about what the Trump presidency will mean for people or might mean for people. What is it like for you to see that comparison and to see the parallels between the Dobson's philosophies and our current hellscape reality?
I mean, first of all, like I think it's twice in 2 months now that like some, like conservative commentator guy, I think it was first Tucker Carlson and then Mel Gibson, uh,
God.
who have, come out and like these big conservative forums and basically been like, I love that Trump's back. It's like daddy's home and is taking his belt off. And so like really driving home, like using the physical abuse of children as a metaphor for politics.
Hmm.
And so they're really making my work very easy in terms of like, well, you guys have some psychosexual child abuse issues that like
It's
you
so
are
horny.
it's so horny, it's so disturbing, it's so like the essence of this mindset of well, I suffered and I can't ever acknowledge that I've suffered or been weak. And so I will like defend the system that hurt me when I was small and helpless to the death.
Hmm.
I will empathize with the aggressor because I would rather die than admit that I was ever a victim. I mean, it's this incredibly punitive ethos. And then the other element is, Dobson was really like Dobson's rise was a response to these youth-led
Hmm.
um movements, particularly the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, and saying, okay, we've got to get the youth under control. We've got to control the children. That's why we're focusing on the family.
Hmm.
His absolute remit, his like sine qua non, raison d'etre, all of those phrases that mean the point, is obedience, right? And and
Yeah.
and we're seeing now like this hyper focus on obedience is inherently authoritarian. It creates authoritarian households, it creates willing authoritarians. When your family environment is an authoritarian state in microcosm, unless you're an iconoclast or someone with, a personal reason, such as queerness or like kindness or contrary to break out of that mindset at great personal cost. I mean, like I did leave a fundamentalist faith too, and it cost me. It cost me certainty. It cost me knowing my place in the world. It cost me
Mhm.
community that I knew would be there for me. And I'm a lucky person. Like my family still talks to me. It was a rough
Yeah.
couple of years. There was like a don't ask, don't tell type situation about like my faith for a while, and then we kind of came to terms with it. It helps that my siblings have all stayed in the faith, so
Mm,
I don't have to be I'm not the sole guardian of the next generation or whatever.
yeah.
But yeah, like I know how much it costs. And conversely, like people are just like so invested in defending the way they were raised and not examining it and not examining that pain that they're way more willing to just inflict that on everyone.
Hmm.
Like in so many ways, the essence of this movement is about inflicting pain
Yeah.
in this cycle of like unaddressable private horror.
Hmm.
And so that's why, I think constantly about the refrain from this poem by W.H. Auden about uh, September 1st, 1939, where he says, I and the public know what all school children learn. Those to whom evil are done do evil in return. It's just something I
Yeah.
think about all the time.
In therapy school, we talk a lot about interrupting intergenerational trauma. And I think it's a really important thing. And I think it actually something that I was grappling with as I was reading your book that I hadn't really like fully understood was the adults that I was dealing with as a kid were raised under the Dobson world and kind of like that level of intergenerational trauma. But also it's not just like straight line down, it's also out, right? Like it's not just inflicting it on their kids, it's also inflicting it on the country, their community.
It's also inflicting it up in a certain
Yes.
way that like because these parenting doctrines are basically like God wants you to do this, you'll be damned and your children will be damned if you don't beat your children. Then you create this strict father deity who's very invested in beating the shit out of you and everybody else.
Hmm.
And so your theocracy, your theology is punitive, and the theocracy you create out of it is going to be fixated on punishment. So yeah, like it's outward, upward, inward, every direction because pain never stands still.
No. And unaddressed pain doesn't go away. I think that's something that I've seen time and time again in therapy. You can't suppress it, you can't compartmentalize it. You might be able to do that for a time to a degree, but the only way out is through. You have to be able to actually, and I think to me that's helps explain partly why a lot of people are so unwilling to look at themselves and their own complicity in the systems, because that means actually feeling the amount of pain that they've been putting off for so long. And I don't necessarily mean that to be like empathizing or to take away people's accountability. I think in some ways it's a very selfish move for some people to be like, you are hurting and you're not dealing with it, and therefore you're making everyone else around you suffer. But
I mean, like at the beginning of my book about like, neo-Nazis, I say like these are human beings. And I don't say that to excuse them. I
mhm,
say that, in fact, to condemn them further because
yes,
these are not monsters born monsters. I don't really think that, I mean, maybe with like certain rare I don't know, murderous exceptions. Like there's such a thing as a born monster.
Hmm.
I think people are products of both nature and nurture, and people who are able to break away from and examine the cruelties that they were raised with, which is an ongoing and like lifelong
Hmm.
process. Um, that's a difficult thing, and a lot of people lack the capacity or the desire to do it. But that doesn't excuse them for
Yes.
perpetuating those cruelties. It doesn't excuse them in the least. It's an explanation, sure.
Mm.
Just because, people who experience atrocity in one war go on to commit atrocities in another. Like that's not an excuse. That's just a cycle of violence perpetuating itself. And the people at the center of that cycle who commit cruelty and reinvent the cycle, like they are absolutely morally culpable for their actions.
Explanation, but not an excuse, is a phrase that I use just in my personal life a lot of like, we can understand this, and also responsibility, accountability. That doesn't mean that it's okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. And I think there's also like some Hollywood element to it where it's like
Mm.
if you give like a villain a traumatic background,
Mm.
it generally like signals some humanization or some shift or whatever. And it's like that's not necessarily how it works. Like plenty of people have a traumatic background and like it lends them more empathy. It doesn't strip their empathy away.
Yeah.
Or they have maladaptive survival mechanisms and then learn to transcend them. So again, it's not an excuse, but I do think it's this lurking, unexplored explanation for like why America is so fucked up and violent. We're
Mm.
the only country in the world that hasn't ratified the UN, Convention on the Rights of the Child. Like
Hmm.
there's corporal punishment in our public schools and the religious movement that is currently in, absolute like disproportionate power is rabidly pro corporal punishment at much higher levels than other elements of American society. So, I think corporal punishment and then this sort of mental torture of being trained to absolute obedience, this is fallow and important ground in terms of explaining how we got here, why our political culture is so
Hmm.
violent, and why our society is so violent. Like, we don't talk about it.
Absolutely. I don't have good questions about this, but you talk a lot about homeschooling. That's something that is on our list of things to get into. We haven't done a super deep dive. At some point, we're going to do like a probably like 12-part series on like Bill Gothard and his horrible stuff. But what stands out to you about homeschooling as a culture, like the Christian right homeschooling culture specifically?
Well, first of all, that so much of modern homeschooling was essentially
Yeah.
invented by the Christian right. Like, and I don't think that's something people really know. Like, it's like literally prior to the like 80s, homeschooling in the US was pretty vanishingly rare.
Hmm.
Um, it was largely illegal because of truancy laws that sort of first came about when like mandatory public schooling like came into existence.
Hmm.
And as part of this broader backlash against the desegregation of public schools, part of this youth control movement at which Dobson was at the absolute forefront with his daring dare to discipline and
Hmm.
beat the shit out of kids and dogs.
Yeah, dare to be abusive.
Yeah, like dare to beat the shit out of your kids. There was really this profound transformation where you have the evangelical organization, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. No, wait. HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association. Yes.
Hmm.
Sorry, I'm like always worried I'm gonna screw up that. Anyway, they straight up like basically employed a bunch of lawyers and was started by a lawyer, Michael Ferris, a guy who also big time sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And then they adopted a 50 state strategy of like, let's weaken all these laws about mandatory public schooling. Like prior to that, you had some hippies and like some parents of disabled kids who like, you know, usually worked stuff out with like the relevant school district.
Mm-hmm.
There were relatively few lawsuits about homeschooling. It just like was not a major point of contention and until like the evangelical 80s when you had like the Christian right at sort of the previous to now peak of its powers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and even to this day, like the vast majority of kids who are homeschooled in America are homeschooled for religious reasons,
Mm-hmm.
most of whom are Christian. Like the homeschool community in the US is wildly evangelical in its tenor and in who like who are homeschool students. They're like really disproportionately white evangelical kids. And then the other thing about it is that boy, like I've read a lot of these curricula. They're not
Mm-hmm.
good. Um and a lot of times like being a parent doesn't qualify you to be a teacher. Like,
Mm-hmm.
those are different things. I mean, I have a lot to say. And if you want to
Uh-huh.
invite me on for any one of your homeschooling episodes, I'm happy to like come and babble. First of all, when you are like just to connect it with the theme of child abuse, like when you take your kid out of school, you isolate them inherently from any of the mandatory reporters that of child abuse that
Mm-hmm.
kids would naturally encounter from, teachers to nurses,
Mm-hmm.
so that like abusive situations are much more likely to escalate to much more frightening, painful, and even fatal conclusions than situations in which a child is regularly exposed to adults who are mandatory reporters outside the home.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like level one, in which, abuse can be enabled by homeschooling. But level two, and I think something that's much more common than like child torture, is just that very often, and particularly for girls, it entails educational neglect,
Yes.
profound educational neglect that ultimately means, you know, it is much more difficult for folks who are homeschooled and educationally neglected in this way to escape their communities and to survive outside of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it does serve some ends, but, particularly female children in these sort of large quiverful families wind up, in lieu of being educated and even in lieu of having a childhood, essentially becoming drafted as little mothers of
Mm-hmm.
their younger siblings, and their education, such as it is with these, you know, Bob Jones and Abacad and whatnot, Sunlight curriculums.
Tapestry of Grace, that's one that my parents used.
Yeah, it's they're often racist, they're often wildly inaccurate, their information is often dated.
Mm-hmm.
Many times, like because these parents don't really understand how to teach like seven kids, which
Mm-hmm.
neither do I. Like, that's not a diss. That's just, it's not like something you're born knowing.
Yeah.
There's a reason people like get graduate education to do it. A lot of times people are left to just like, kids are just left to like, well, watch this James Dobson videotape,
Mm-hmm.
alone, or like do all your assessments self-guided, or education as like a treat that can be taken away if you behave badly. As I say in the book, schools like have external accountability. They're
Yeah.
measured on like school system basis or like by the hundreds of students, whereas like homeschooling's unit is one home.
Mm-hmm.
And it should not be surprising that there are like wildly disparate outcomes, and many of them are very negative.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and then yeah, and just the total triumph of the homeschooling lobby, the evangelical Christian homeschooling lobby is astounding. Like the sheer lack of any protective legislation for kids in, at this point, the majority of states. I mean,
Yeah.
forget like requiring homeschooling parents to like have a teaching qualification, like, you know, forget that. It's like, do you have to inform the school district before you pull your kid out? And like, that's
Right.
not even true in lots and lots of states. There's no checking. There's no like, is this child okay? Is this child
Hmm.
beaten? Can this child read? Like the neglect is staggering, and the current administration is only going to like push harder against whatever like tiny backstop exists in some states.
Yeah. As I alluded to, I was homeschooled for a period of time. My mom personally did a great job. Sometimes she listens. Mom, this is not critiquing you. But the process, she told the school I'm homeschooling my child, and they basically went, okay. She didn't have to like, I don't think she had to fill out any paperwork. I don't think she actually like had to tell them. I didn't have to take any standardized tests. It was just like you were saying, just no oversight of any kind. And even at the time I was in seventh grade, like that struck me as like weird and kind of fucked up. And reflecting back now as an adult, and especially while reading your book, I was thinking about this a lot. Like, there's a lot of really bad parents out there who don't have their kids' best interest in mind and don't act in ways that honor their kids' autonomy, or even if they think they have their kids' best interest in mind, like don't aren't able to provide for them in meaningful ways, whether it be emotionally or physically or intellectually.
Yeah, I mean, like the church is very much pushing homeschooling,
Hmm.
and it's pushing it even more now. But the idea was always like these, public schools are godless and communist, and now
Hmm.
and they're also like mixing the races.
Hmm.
And it's basically the same message, just like mixed and matched for whatever era you're in. But it's a tremendous burden to put on parents. It's like not only should you make sure this child is clean and fed and whatever, but like now you're suddenly responsible for spending, hours and hours and hours of your day doing something that you like don't really know how to do, weren't trained in how to do it.
Hmm.
First of all, malicious and abusive parents exist.
Hmm.
But even if we like turn away from malicious and abusive parents, there's so much inadvertent neglect that can
Yeah.
happen. And like you said, like your mom was awesome at homeschooling, and that's awesome. And like I'm not being like never homeschool ever, like, but I am saying there's way too much ability for a child to just
Hmm.
vanish into these very intentionally set cracks. And to me, it's also very telling that a sort of another category of legal fight, now that they've basically won the fight against truancy laws, um, that the HSLDA engages in on the regular is defending parents accused of physically abusing their kids. Like,
Yeah.
it's the same organization. And they regularly, like, even in cases of like abuse that just like makes you want to like tear your hair out, like kids being like kept in cages and starved and like beaten, and they came out like vigorously against a proposed California law that
Hmm.
would have made courts like able to consider in cases of like child cruelty, whether like a child was struck with an implement, and they like came out and wrote these like op-eds about this is interfering with a parent's right to discipline a child. in a godly way. Like,
Hmm.
you're just like, we're talking about like hitting kids with shoes, and they're like, no, like you should be able to hit your kid with a shoe, and we're gonna put it in the newspaper that we want you to hit your kid with a shoe, and
Hmm.
whatever. Like, I don't think it stops at shoes either, what they
Yeah.
defend. So it's just the to me like the issues of child abuse and or neglect and homeschooling are as intimately intertwined as the HSLDA says they are.
Hmm.
Taking my cue from sort of the organization at the heart of the modern homeschooling movement in the US.
Yeah. And that part of your book, when you're really talking about these instances of child abuse and neglect, and the way that homeschooling was used to increase them and perpetuate them, I think that was the hardest part of the book for me to get through. Not because I feel precious about trying to defend homeschooling, but just the the heartbreak that I was feeling and the anger that I was feeling. You at one point quote a press release, I think it was from the HSLDA, about that California law, and then you say someone there was a mass shooting at a school the day before, and they didn't say a word about that, but beating with your child with an instrument, with a shoe, with a spoon, whatever, that's what they care about.
I think that was more parentalrights.org. That was
That's right.
parentalrights.org, which like parents' rights is really like the big old euphemism for this movement.
Hmm.
Just so any of your listeners know, I'm sure they do already, but like when someone is bringing up parental rights, I'm running in the other direction. Like that's
Hmm.
such a fucking red flag for me because I'm like, who doesn't really have rights in this country and definitely should is like children,
Children.
kids. They're human beings who like shouldn't be like starved or kept illiterate or beaten. Like I think that or put in solitary confinement. Like that's not something our country acknowledges, but which I think is morally true.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I mean, parental rights is there, but yeah, it was like parentalrights.org put out this whole thing about how evil the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is basically like don't torture children. Um, literally its first clause is like every child should have a name. But they put out this whole blog post about how it's evil and it's bad and it will, mess with your ability to raise your kids and freedom. And yeah, there was a school shooting the day before and they didn't say shit about that.
Hmm.
Just like how bad it is if kids have rights. Like,
Hmm.
I don't even bother pointing out hypocrisy or purported hypocrisy anymore because
Yeah.
first of all, you have to have standing to the person that you're addressing as a hypocrite in order to effectively accuse them of hypocrisy, and none of us have that.
Hmm.
We're not the elect, we're not right with Jesus. And then the other piece is that like if someone wants power and has a will to power, like they don't give a fuck about being accused of hypocrisy. Like they're like, okay, whatever. That's what I needed to say that day to acquire power, and here's what I'm gonna say today to acquire power. Like the whole like, oh, Project 2025 isn't our agenda. JK was our agenda all along. Like they don't care.
Shocking. Right.
They're like, haha, fooled you. Like it's not, they have to view you as like fully human for your accusation of hypocrisy to matter. And that's just really not the case here. That's not the case we're in. It's like, you're aligned with us or you're aligned with Lucifer, and those are the two options.
You've described yourself and your work as feminist and anti-fascist. I try to move in those directions with my work as well. And when possible, I try to give people actionable things to do. I think it's one part to say this is bad and here's why, and it's another thing to say, and here's a better way of moving forward. Here's what we're doing about it. What do you see as key pieces or actions in this ongoing anti-fascist fight, especially now that we are 1 week into the second Trump administration?
I mean, it's like
Can you solve it for us? Can you solve fascism for us?
Oh God. Well, no, it's not that. It's just that like I mean, I do believe knowledge is power, and like a big part of why I wrote this book in the first place was sort of from a know your enemy, like defensive crouch of just like it's good to understand your enemy on like a very deep level. Um to fight them more effectively, but then it comes to the like let's fight them more effectively and I'm like, no.
Right.
I don't know. I do think it's important. This is very vague and wooey, but so much of what the Christian right wants is conformity
Mhm.
and obedience for everyone to look the same, to love the same, to perform gender the same, to believe in the same God. And I think this is a moment for people who oppose that cruel, meretricious worldview to embrace our differences and those of others and like be real loud about being freaky,
Hmm.
as much as that's safe for you, like embrace the ways in which you do not conform to this agenda and like live that very fully and freely and joyously as much as you can, as much as that's safe for you, and help others to do so.
Hmm.
That's like one piece of it, because we have to be a very loud cacophony to drown out these like marching goose steps, right?
Yeah.
And then the other piece of it, and this is also vague and wooey, is like this is a movement that very much has aligned itself against like literally the concept of empathy.
The sin of empathy, one could say.
Yeah, yeah, that's a recent book. Also, there was like it's like the tyranny of empathy or something,
Hmm.
by like one of these Christian right authors, basically arguing that like the liberal Christian, like Jesus wants you to be nice to everyone thing is a heresy. And even outside a Christian framework, it's this like radically like anti-empathy worldview. And even if you're just going on simple oppositional principles, if that's what they want, it's bad, then then your task is to embrace empathy as fully as possible and see where that takes you in your community, in society as a whole. And I think like the kind of empathy that involves praying with your feet, as they say,
Hmm.
doing something in your community and with people. So I mean, listen, that's like far from some comprehensive battle plan, but those are
Yeah.
places to start, is like embrace the things that make us different and embrace empathy. And I think embrace actionable empathy. And
Yeah.
then once you're there, I think you're already a couple steps down, the road to figuring out how to fight.
I think it's so important. I spent this past Friday at a leather bar here in Chicago and just being around all with so much love, all these fucking freaks felt, especially after the first week, the first like business week of the Trump administration, felt so important. It wasn't just having a good time, although it was that, but it really felt precarious in a way. Like I don't know how much longer places like this are going to be allowed to exist. Chicago is very privileged in a lot of ways, and we have a lot of protections, but I know people in Kansas or Kentucky or whatever who a lot of their queer bars, even before Trump took power, were already being closed with some frequency. So maintaining that, yeah, that uniqueness, that difference, and I think empathy and kindness are so, I think like to actually understand them and to have done the work in yourself to see past your own hurts, like we were talking about, like that is such a needed skill and such a needed value and pretty radical.
Yeah, I mean, I threw a Burns supper this weekend. It's like
Mm,
a Scottish thing where you like celebrate the poet Robert Burns and basically have a bunch of whiskey and recite poems. I
incredible.
invited a whole bunch of my friends. I'm not like Scottish or or even that passionate about Robert Burns. Like he's fine, he's good, they're fun.
Sure.
But mostly I just wanted people to like show up and sing and recite poems, and it's like who knows when we'll be able to like gather with joy in our hearts again and like sing out and in different keys and from different eras. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it is about, I think, like that outreach and that joy. And also putting up with people you find kind of annoying. Like
Yeah.
you can't build a coalition based on like when, your chief values are like, I can't be around anyone who's cringe or annoying. Because
Hmm.
most people are. I'm not saying that you should compromise, who you are or your ideals, but rather that like you might have to suspend some of the joys of misanthropy for a little while if you want to be a meaningful coalition with a
Yeah,
lot of people.
absolutely.
Thanks for having me on, and I apologize because once I get on the subject of hating James Dobson, I don't stop talking.
Thank you so much for joining us. A couple of my or your things that I want to make sure that I plug. Obviously, your book, Wild Faith: How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. Your first book you alluded to a number of times, but it's called Culture Warlords: My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy. I encourage people to go out and buy both of those. You also have a newsletter called The Sword and the Sandwich. I do have a very important question, which is, what is your go-to sandwich?
Chicken salad with cheddar cheese melted on it on like a solid sourdough
Nice.
um is pretty good to me. I embrace sandwich. I embrace many sandwiches. The Sword of the Sandwich is my newsletter. It's on Button Down because I moved off Substack because they're like, we love Nazis. Every other Tuesday, I write like a long political post. Every Friday, I chronicle a different sandwich from Wikipedia's list of notable sandwiches. We're up to the 122nd essay on the list this Friday.
Incredible.
And then every Sunday there's a column about like culture from either me or my editor David. So that's the newsletter, and that's honestly what I'm spending a lot of my time on these days. If you want to come see my writing, come hang.
Right.
And thanks again for having me on.
Of course. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, and you have some very lucky clients who are you're helping see through this time. All right, well, take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to Talia Lavin for this conversation. Please go out and support her work however you can. It is definitely worth the investment. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and keep hating James Dobson. God damn, do I fucking hate James Dobson. I'll see you all next time. I Hate James Dobson is a labor of love, written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Jake. I'm honored to be joined by my amazing co-host, Brooke. If you're enjoying the show, please consider rating and reviewing it, and if you want to connect with us more, you can find us on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Reddit, and BlueSky at I Hate James Dobson, and, unfortunately still, on Twitter at I Hate JDobs. If you want to email us, you can do so at ihatejamesdobson@gmail.com. Special thanks, as always, to Drew, Lindsay, DJ, and Jack. Our theme music is by Mood Maze, and the song is called Trendsetter. Thank you for enjoying the show.